Story 1. The Man Next Door During Lockdown. It happened during the winter lockdown of 2020 in a small town near Glasgow Airport called Renfrew. Streets were empty, windows were dark, and the world seemed frozen in silence. For most people, that quiet was safety isolation from the invisible threat outside. But for one woman named Kiran Shahal, it was the quiet that nearly got her killed. Kiran was in her late 20s. Her family ran a small Indian restaurant, the kind of place everyone in town knew. Before the pandemic, the restaurant had been alive with music and conversation, but by December, it survived only through takeaway orders. Kiran helped in the evenings driving to and from her home through the same narrow back road each night. It was the only route still open after road closures, a stretch of cold asphalt surrounded by fields and half-lit houses. She lived with her parents and two siblings, though on most nights she left for work alone. Next door, a middle-aged man had rented the adjoining property a year earlier. Her family didn't know much about him. He kept to himself, rarely spoke, rarely waved. But recently, another man had started appearing around his house. Someone new, someone who watched too much. Kiran began to notice him during the weeks before Christmas. Whenever she left for work or returned home, he was there standing near the fence, motionless, staring. Not curious, not polite, just staring. His eyes never blinked. His expression never changed. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. Everyone was restless under lockdown, lonely, desperate for contact. But something about his gaze made her skin tighten. That feeling grew until it followed her everywhere, the awareness of being observed even when she couldn't see anyone. She started keeping her head down, her keys ready in her hands, and whenever she stepped outside. One night, the cold was sharp enough to frost the windshields and turn every breath into smoke. Her parents and siblings had already gone ahead to open the restaurant, and she was running late. The streets were deserted, the world blanketed in silence. She stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under her boots, echoing through the air, and that was when it happened. The man next door was there again. His presence was wrong too, still too close. His eyes followed her movements in a way that made her stomach twist. It was the first time he ever acknowledged her directly. The look he gave her wasn't curiosity or friendliness. It was hunger. For a long moment, she froze, unsure how to react. The night pressed around her, heavy and suffocating. Then she forced herself into the car, hands trembling on the wheel. The figure still stood there, motionless, watching. The longer she looked, the more she realized something unnatural in the way he didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't seem to breathe. The windows were frosted over. She couldn't see well enough to drive yet. The air inside the car fogged with her own breath. Every instinct told her to leave, but she couldn't not until the windshield cleared. Her body stayed rigid, heart-hammering eyes fixed on the figure outside. When she finally dared to glance up again, he was gone. The relief came quickly, then vanished when she realized she had forgotten her phone inside the house. She hesitated, weighing fear against logic. Her family would expect her to text when she arrived at the restaurant. She needed the phone. The man was gone. It would only take a few seconds. She stepped out and rushed toward the door. Inside the house was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow from the streetlight outside. The silence felt thicker than before. She grabbed her phone from the counter, turned toward the door, and froze. A sound, small, dull, like a footstep, came from the front hall. It was impossible to tell where it came from. The space beyond the door looked darker than it should have been. She stood still, breath shallow, waiting. Nothing followed. After a moment, she convinced herself it had been the wind, maybe the creak of old wood. She locked the door behind her, walked quickly back to the car and started down the road. 2 minutes later, the steering felt wrong. The car pulled to one side, the tires grinding against the pavement. She stopped, stepped out, and saw that her back left tire was completely flat. The edges of the rubber were shredded, slashed cleanly open. The road was empty, no houses nearby, no sound except the whisper of wind through the bare trees. She stood in the beam of her own headlights, phone in hand, panic rising in her throat. Then a pair of headlights appeared behind her, bright, sudden, flooding the darkness. The car came to a stop inches away from her bumper, high beams burning into her eyes. She turned blinded, unable to see who was inside. The air was so cold that her breath hung in front of her face like smoke. A door slammed. Footsteps on the asphalt. Then something gloved and heavy clamped over her mouth. The world collapsed into chaos, the smell of leather, the pressure of the hand, the sound of her own muffled breathing. She struggled, but the grip was too strong. Panic blurred everything except the realization that she knew the voice behind her. It was the man next door. What happened next was mechanical, practiced. She felt tape ripping from a roll, the sting of adhesive against her skin, the cold of metal pressing into her wrists as her hands were bound behind her back. The rag covering her mouth tasted of dust and plastic. Her vision blurred with tears. She couldn't scream, couldn't breathe properly. Her body trembled violently, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. He forced her against the car, taping her mouth shut, binding her ankles. The night around them stayed silent, as if the world had turned its back. Her breath escaped in short, panicked bursts that turned to vapor in the freezing air. Then, for reasons she would never understand, he walked to the front of the car and turned off the engine. That small act saved her life. The bindings on her legs were weak. She kicked once, then again, breaking the tape enough to move. When he returned to the back of the car, she struck out with everything she had. Her heel connected once, twice. He fell to the ground, gasping. She tore the tape from her wrists and mouth, the adhesive ripping at her skin, and stumbled backward, grabbing her phone from the ground. Her fingers barely worked as she called the police. Within minutes, the blue lights of patrol cars cut through the night. The man was arrested where he lay. His real name was not Alec, as he had told her. The police discovered that he had been living illegally in the neighbor's house while the owner was away during lockdown. He had been stealing mail, reading names off packages, watching her every day from a few feet away. Kieran survived. Her family sold the restaurant later that year, unable to bear the memories of that winter. She started martial arts lessons soon after, hoping to reclaim a sense of control that had been stripped from her that night. Therapy helped, but some fears never fade completely. Even now, years later, when she drives down an empty road and catches a glimpse of headlights in her mirror, her body tenses. She knows she's safe. But that's the problem with survival safety, never feels the same again. Not every haunting comes from ghosts. Some come from people who hide behind walls, waiting for the right night, the right moment of silence to step out of the dark. Story 2. The basement voice that sounded like a child. Every police officer carries one story that never really goes away. For me, it happened during a violent thunderstorm in the middle of my first year on the force. I was 21, working the graveyard shift in a small town that rarely made the news. The streets were quiet. My cruiser warmed the radio, humming low with the sound of rain against the windows. I was young, tired, and naive enough to believe that most nights would end the same way they started, uneventful. It was close to 2 in the morning when the call came through. The dispatcher's voice sounded tight and uneasy, even through the static. Someone had called emergency services, claiming to be held captive inside a house on the west side of town. The line had gone dead before the caller could give details. When dispatch tried calling back, there was no answer. There was something about the report that unsettled everyone. The caller had sounded like an adult, but their voice was distorted, high-pitched, childlike, as if filtered through some kind of digital device. The dispatcher warned us to proceed with extreme caution. I was the closest unit. Another officer named Chris volunteered to back me up. Outside, the storm had swallowed the town whole. Roads were flooding, streetlights flickered, and the power grid had failed in half the area. By the time I reached the neighborhood, everything was dark. Chris's cruiser was already parked at the end of the street, headlights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. The two of us stood in front of a house that looked long abandoned. Grass reached our knees. The windows were covered with overgrown branches, and the roof was dented and missing tiles. The entire property looked forgotten by time. Yet someone inside had made that call. The front porch creaked beneath our boots as we approached. I rang the doorbell, though I knew the power was out. Through the heavy rain, I thought I heard movement behind the door. Slow, hesitant footsteps that stopped just on the other side. It was as if someone was standing there listening. After several long seconds, the lock turned. The door opened a few inches. A pale face appeared in the gap, a man in his 30s, overweight glasses fogged with moisture. His eyes darted nervously between us. He looked like the kind of man who hadn't been outside in weeks. When I explained why we were there, his expression froze. He claimed it must have been a mistake. A wrong number, a pocket dial. He said he lived alone. His hands trembled as he spoke. The smell leaking from the doorway was sickening mold, sweat, rot. I told him we would need to take a look inside, and he refused. So I went back to my cruiser, contacted dispatch, and within minutes, a telephonic warrant came through. When I returned, the man's eyes widened as I stepped past him into the darkness. The air inside was thick. My flashlight swept across piles of clothing, dirty dishes, and insects crawling along the floorboards. It looked less like a home and more like a garbage heap that had been sealed shut for years. But among the filth, small things stood out a pink Barbie dollhouse placed neatly in the corner, children's shoes lined against the wall, a stuffed animal sitting upright on a couch that smelled of decay. The man muttered something about nieces visiting, though no sane parent would let a child step foot in a place like this. Chris kept him by the door, while I moved deeper down the hall. The first room I checked was filled with toys. Dolls, diapers, little dresses folded on the bed in precise, color-coded stacks. Everything was arranged with obsessive care, which only made the rest of the house feel more disturbing. In the corner sat a life-sized doll wearing a woman's blouse and jeans, its plastic skin reflecting the beam of my flashlight. The head hung forward as if it had been scolded. For a moment, I thought it was a real person. By then, every instinct I had was screaming. There was something wrong here. Something calculated and predatory in the way the house was organized. At the end of the hallway, I found a door leading down to the basement. The man's tone changed the moment he realized where I was going. He pleaded for us to check upstairs instead, his voice cracking as he insisted there was nothing down there. Chris ordered him to stay still. I pulled the door open. The stairwell was steep and narrow, the kind built long before safety codes existed. The smell grew stronger as I descended, like a mixture of rust and something organic. Halfway down, I heard a faint rattling from somewhere in the dark. Metal scraping against wood. The kind of sound that feels too deliberate to be a coincidence. I reached the basement floor and swept my flashlight across boxes and old furniture. The noise came again, this time from a smaller room across the space. Its door was closed. I aimed my light at it and listened. The air felt wrong, charged electric, heavy with fear. I moved closer, staying to the side of the door frame. The handle was cold under my glove. When I pushed the door open, the beam of my flashlight caught the shape of a man crouched on the floor. He was thin, pale, his wrists covered in fresh and healed scars. His clothes were filthy, his eyes unfocused from the light. For a second I thought he might lunge, but he didn't move. He just stared at me, like an animal that had forgotten what people looked like. He had been missing for nearly 2 years. A father of 3. Everyone believed he was dead. He had been kept in that basement the entire time, fed, occasionally beaten when he spoke too loudly, locked away whenever anyone came near the house. That night his captor had accidentally left a phone on the basement floor while delivering dinner. The man had triggered the voice assistant and managed to call for help. When we arrived, he couldn't bring himself to respond to my commands. He had spent so long being punished for making noise that even hearing his own voice terrified him. Hours later, after we rescued him and arrested the homeowner, the dispatcher told me something that made my stomach turn. During the 911 call, the victim hadn't sounded like an adult. His voice had been high-pitched, trembling like a small child, pretending to speak softly. There was no digital distortion, no malfunction. The man had simply spoken that way out of habit. His captor had forced him to talk like a child for so long that it became the only way he knew how to speak. Even when he finally reached out for help, his voice still belonged to the role he had been forced to play. That night ended with an arrest, a medical transport, and a report that I can still recite by heart. But none of that matters. What stays with me isn't the paperwork or the headlines. It's the silence that filled that basement when I first stepped inside. It's the realization that sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't the ones haunting old houses, they're the ones living quietly inside them. I've worked hundreds of shifts since then, but every time I hear a voice on the radio break through the static, I think about that call. I think about the storm, the smell, and the sound of a man speaking like a child in the dark. And I remind myself that evil doesn't need to be supernatural to feel truly haunted. Story 3. I dated the man who destroyed my mom's life. It began in 2017, the year she transferred to a small private school in New York City called the Smith School. Only 50 students attended, so everyone knew everyone. The place had once been a rehabilitation program for kids with criminal records, but by the time she arrived, it had become a safe space for students with learning issues or emotional struggles. She joined hoping for calm simplicity and a chance to start again. At first, it felt exactly that way. The building smelled of chalk and old paint, the teachers knew every student's name, and the rhythm of classes was slow, almost gentle. Then she met Kyle Fernandez. He was tall, charming, and always surrounded by noise friends who smoked outside the gates, laughter that echoed down the narrow hallways, and a sense that rules existed only for other people. He had been expelled from another school for selling weed. Everyone knew it, but everyone also liked him. He had that careless magnetism that made rebellion look like freedom. She was 16 and lonely, and he noticed her first. What started as friendly attention turned into companionship, then affection. Within weeks, he was walking her home after class, and within months, they were inseparable. In the beginning, Kyle was kind. He told jokes that broke tension, shared snacks at lunch, and treated her gently when others didn't. He smelled of cheap cologne and cigarettes, and his voice always carried the faintest laugh, as if life were a game he was effortlessly winning. She convinced herself he was misunderstood rather than dangerous. But beneath the surface, something darker pulsed. He was high most of the time, living in a haze of smoke and half-formed promises. His friends hung out on corners, their pants sagging, their eyes heavy, their jokes mean. She stayed quiet when they mocked others. She didn't belong to their world, but through Kyle, she had one foot in it. The first cracks appeared quietly. He became jealous of the smallest things, how long she spent talking to teachers who messaged her phone where she sat during lunch. He began to hover, to question, to twist concern into control. Still, she stayed. It was easier to believe the relationship was special than to admit it was turning toxic. One summer night in 2018, the illusion broke. They were alone in her room, surrounded by the faint hum of city traffic outside. Her phone vibrated again and again on the desk, a series of notifications that filled the space with tiny bursts of sound. The messages came from an old friend who loved sending memes, harmless, stupid jokes that made her laugh. She opened one, smiled, and for a second forgot Kyle was there. The air shifted. He wanted to know who it was. She explained. His expression hardened. The conversation spiraled from suspicion to anger in seconds. Before she could react, her phone hit the wall, shattering on impact. Glass scattered across the bedspread and the floor. Then came the moment that would replay in her mind for years. He picked up one of the broken pieces, its edge glittering under the lamp, and pressed it into her arm. The cut was quick, sharp, almost surgical. Pain flared, followed by shock, then disbelief. She didn't scream right away. Her body refused to understand what had happened. When the blood began to run, he fled. She cleaned the wound herself, shaking tears mixing with the water from the tap. Her mother was out working a night shift, so there was no one to call. She wrapped the arm in gauze and watched the blood soak through. In the reflection of the mirror, she looked like someone else entirely. That night, she blocked his number and decided never to speak to him again. Life moved on. Months passed. She finished school, found a job, pretended nothing had happened. She told friends that the relationship had simply fallen apart. She never mentioned the glass. 5 years later, in August 2023, everything returned in a single phone call. She was at work when her phone vibrated in her pocket. The number carried a 212 area code, New York City, but she didn't recognize it. On instinct, she answered. A woman's voice identified herself as calling from New York Presbyterian Hospital. Her mother had been struck by a car, along with several other pedestrians. 10 people injured. One driver responsible. Her mother was in critical condition. She didn't remember leaving work. She just remembered running through the heat, through red lights, up hospital stairs, until she reached the room where her mother lay still, and silent tubes and wires tracing her body like veins of plastic. The monitors beeped slowly. The nurses moved with calm efficiency. The story came out in fragments. A man had stolen a car while intoxicated, driven the wrong way down a one-way street, and plowed into a sidewalk crowded with cyclists and pedestrians. Witnesses said the impact sent bodies flying, colliding mid-air before hitting the ground. It sounded like something from a disaster film. She asked for the driver's name. At first, no one could tell her. The police were still confirming identity. She sat by her mother's bedside all night, replaying the accident in her head, trying to make sense of how random life could be. The next morning, an officer came to speak with her. The man behind the wheel had been caught and taken into custody. His name was Kyle Fernandez. The world folded in on itself. The hospital room seemed to shrink. It was as if the past she had buried had climbed out of the ground and found her again, bringing a new kind of pain with it. The boy she once loved had become the man who nearly killed her mother. Her mother survived, but the damage was permanent. The doctors explained that she would never walk again. The news broke something inside her that therapy still hasn't been able to fix. When the case went to court, she wrote a statement describing what Kyle had done years earlier, the night with the broken phone and the glass. Her words were read aloud. Another woman came forward with her own story of abuse at his hands. Together, they painted a portrait of a man who had been violent long before the crash. The sentence was shockingly short, 2.5 years in prison. 7 victims, 2 women scarred for life, and still the law treated him as if he could change. She listened to the verdict in silence, her hands trembling, wondering how justice could feel so hollow. Now, when she walks through the city, she sometimes thinks she sees him in passing reflections in a subway window, in a car mirror, in the glow of a streetlight. She knows he is behind bars, but trauma plays tricks. Every honking car feels like an echo. Every drunk shout in the night sounds like his voice. She tells herself she has moved on, but the truth is simpler and crueler. She has learned that evil doesn't always arrive wearing a mask. Sometimes it smiles, tells you you're special, and sits across from you in class. Her mother is still in therapy, learning to live with the wheelchair. The family survives one day at a time, and she survives too, though the scar on her arm has never fully faded. It runs along the skin like a pale reminder that love can be the first cut in a horror story no ghost could ever match. She no longer believes in haunted houses or cursed objects. The real horror lives in people, the ones who think affection gives them ownership, the ones who mistake control for love. When she looks back on it now, she doesn't picture the crash or the blood or the hospital lights. She remembers a quiet night in 2018, the sound of glass breaking, and the way a single decision to love someone unstable set everything else in motion. That's the thing about real-life horror. It doesn't need shadows or ghosts. It just needs a heartbeat, a car engine, and a moment you wish you could take back. Story 4. The girl who was always just behind me. In 8th grade, he first noticed her as nothing more than a quiet shape in the background of every crowd. She wasn't invisible exactly, just the kind of person the eyes skim past without landing. Small, pale, always with her head tilted slightly down, as if she was listening to something nobody else could hear. At first, she was just another classmate. Then, she became something else entirely. He didn't remember adding her on social media. One day, her name appeared in his notifications. The profile had no picture, no posts, just a blank icon and a single follow request. It seemed harmless. Their school was small. Everyone followed everyone. He accepted without thinking. That night, she sent him a message. Just one word. A greeting so ordinary it barely registered. The next morning, there were paragraphs waiting for him, long streams of text. About her day, about nothing at all, about everything. Then more, the following night. Soon, the messages became part of his routine. Every time he woke up, every time he went to bed, there she was. At first, it felt flattering, someone noticing him in a way others didn't. But as the weeks passed, the tone shifted. She began describing what he wore that day, how he laughed with his friends, the way he leaned against his locker. She mentioned moments that had happened hours earlier, sometimes seconds. It took him longer than it should have to realize she had been watching him. Her words grew specific. She described his red shirt, his backpack, the way he rubbed his temple when tired. Then came the photographs. They arrived late at night, usually without captions. The first was harmless, a blurry shot of him in the school hallway. Then more followed. Him in class, him leaving the cafeteria, him sitting on the bus, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, and behind that reflection, her face. That was when the fear began to bloom. He blocked the account. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. But within an hour, a new profile appeared. Same name, different spelling. Same blank picture. The messages resumed. This time the tone was wounded, confused, obsessive. She wrote about how he had hurt her by ignoring her, how she thought they were becoming close. The next day he found something tucked inside his backpack, a small folded note. The handwriting was small and neat, almost delicate. The message was short, written in pencil, that had pressed too hard into the paper. It said only that he didn't need to be afraid, because she was already close. After that, he began to notice her everywhere. She leaned against walls between classes, tying her shoe whenever he walked past. She stood at the end of hallways, pretending to scroll through her phone, but never looking down. The more he tried to avoid her, the more frequently she appeared. He started walking home faster after school. The quiet streets that had always felt safe now pulsed with anxiety. His heartbeat began to sync with the rhythm of his footsteps, each one heavier than the last. One evening, he turned the corner toward his street and felt that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable awareness of being followed. When he looked over his shoulder, she was there several feet behind, walking in the same direction. Her pace matched his exactly. She didn't hide. She didn't run. She just walked, her face blank, her eyes fixed straight ahead. He sprinted the rest of the way home. Inside, he locked every door, checked the windows twice, and stood by his bedroom curtain, too afraid to look outside, but too afraid not to. When he finally peeked through the gap, she was there across the street, standing still, her face tilted up toward his window. She didn't move for a long time. Then she raised her phone. The flash went off once. That night, his phone lit up with a new notification from an app he never remembered giving her. It was a photograph of his house taken from across the road. His bedroom light glowed faintly in the frame. The caption beneath it said only that he looked lonely. For weeks it continued. New accounts, new messages, new reminders that she knew his routine. She mentioned details about his home, the curtains, the way his bed faced the window, the color of his walls. He began to sleep with the blinds closed and the light on his phone face down beside the bed. He stopped going out after dark. His friends teased him about becoming reclusive. He couldn't tell them why. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. No more messages. No more sightings. She disappeared from school altogether. Some said she had transferred. Others whispered that she had been expelled for something she'd done to another student. Nobody knew for sure, and nobody wanted to ask. The silence that followed was almost worse. For months, he felt a strange emptiness, like the absence of something dangerous still hovering just out of reach. He tried to convince himself that it was over. He deleted his old accounts, changed his number, started focusing on sports exams, anything that could drown out the memory. He didn't think about her again until the spring cleaning day, months later. While emptying his closet, he came across an old cardboard shoebox, something he hadn't touched since 8th grade. He opened it absent-mindedly, expecting to find papers or trinkets from old projects. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, each one of him, some taken at school, some outside his house, some through his bedroom window at night. The photos were printed on cheap paper, slightly faded, and stacked neatly. Underneath them, written across the inside of the box lid, in the same neat handwriting as the note, were 3 words, "I'm still close." He stood there in silence, staring at the photos, until his hands began to shake. The air in his room felt colder, as if someone had opened a window behind him. The box fell from his grip, scattering the images across the floor like a deck of cards, each one a memory he never consented to share. he never saw her again. The school moved on, the years passed, and life filled with new faces, new routines, and new fears that made the old ones seem distant. But every so often, when walking home alone, he would feel the same pressure in the air, the faint awareness of being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was recognition. Because some people don't haunt places, they haunt moments. And the most terrifying thing about obsession is that it never really leaves. It just learns to wait. He still lives in the same city, though, never in the same neighborhood. The blinds in his apartment stay closed. The walls are covered with photos of other people, friends, family, loved ones, perhaps as a way to replace the ones she once took. But sometimes, when he passes a reflection in a dark window, he catches a flicker of movement behind him, just out of focus, just far enough away to make him doubt. It's been years since 8th grade, but he still keeps the old shoebox. Not because he wants to, but because throwing it away feels like an invitation. He tells himself it's only paper, only images, nothing supernatural about it. Yet every time he opens a curtain at night, he half expects to see a figure across the street, still watching, still waiting exactly where she left herself all those years ago. Story 5. The closet door that wouldn't stay shut. This story didn't happen to me. It happened to my best friend years ago when he was 11. Even now, when he talks about it, his voice lowers and his eyes drift away, as if part of him is still in that house, still standing in that dark bedroom. He used to live in Massachusetts, in a home that sat on a quiet residential street, surrounded by maple trees and stone walls. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked peaceful in daylight and unsettling after sunset. The house itself was new, at least it looked new. What most people didn't know was that it had been rebuilt from the ashes of another home that burned down years earlier. Nothing of the old structure was supposed to remain. The crews had cleared every beam, every nail, every trace of the past. Or so they thought. When his family moved in, everything felt normal. The layout was simple: 3 bedrooms, a small living room, and his favorite part of the house, a massive walk-in closet attached to his room. For an 11-year-old, it felt like a hidden fortress. It had racks on both sides, shelves along the walls, and a single narrow window at the back. During the day, sunlight poured in through the glass, spilling over the clothes and toys he stored there. At night, it became a black hole. He hated leaving the door open while he slept. The darkness inside the closet wasn't like ordinary darkness. It felt heavy, almost tangible, as if it pressed against the air itself. So every night before bed, he made sure the door was fully shut. Then he'd climb into bed, pull the blanket to his chin, and drift into the kind of deep, dreamless sleep only children seem to have. One night, near the end of winter, something woke him. A light pinch on his leg, faint but distinct enough to stir him from the edge of a dream. At first he thought it was nothing, just a twitch, maybe a muscle spasm. He rolled over, half asleep. A few minutes later, it happened again. A second pinch, a little stronger, followed by a prickling sensation that crawled up his skin. This time he sat up, blinking into the dark. The room was silent except for the hum of the heater. Everything looked the same. The curtains drawn, the toys stacked neatly, the faint outline of the closet door visible across the room. He told himself it was imagination, that he was still half dreaming. But the unease stayed. 5 minutes passed. Then something poked him. Not the random twitch of a muscle, something deliberate. A single, unmistakable jab against his leg. The fear that followed was quiet and absolute. He looked toward the closet and saw that the door was no longer shut. It stood open by an inch, just enough to reveal a sliver of black inside. He froze. He knew he had closed it. He always did. He tried to reason it away. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe air pressure had nudged it open. But the air in the room felt still, and the space beyond that narrow gap looked darker than any shadow he'd ever seen. He called softly for the family cat, a gray creature named Gremlin, who sometimes slipped into rooms unnoticed. No sound came in response. For a few seconds, he convinced himself that she must be inside exploring the shelves. That explanation held until the door moved. Slowly, silently, it opened wider, 2 inches, 3, until the crack revealed the faint glint of the window deep inside the closet. Then, just as slowly, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame. He didn't wait to see what came next. He grabbed his blanket, bolted from the room, and ran downstairs. He spent the rest of the night curled on the couch, the television flickering softly until dawn. The next morning, he told his mother what had happened. She smiled, half amused, half concerned, and said it was probably a dream. The latch, she explained, might have been misaligned. But when they checked, the door latched perfectly. The window inside the closet was closed tight. Nothing seemed out of place. Days turned into weeks. The incident faded into the background like a half-remembered nightmare. Then one afternoon, while playing in the yard, he wandered toward the side of the house where the closet window faced the lawn. The snow had melted, leaving patches of damp earth. That was when he saw it, something small and dark pressed into the grass beneath the window. He bent down and brushed away the dirt. It was a button about the size of a coin made of fabric that had been burned around the edges. The center was scorched, yet the thread holes remained intact. It looked old, impossibly old, the kind of button sewn onto the chest of a teddy bear decades earlier. The sight of it brought a strange stillness over him. The construction crew had told his parents that everything from the original house had been removed, that not a single artifact had survived the fire. Yet here it was, a relic, half buried in the soil, beneath his window, perfectly aligned with the room where the closet stood. He showed it to his mother, but she brushed it off as debris from the previous owner. They threw it away. That night, he checked the closet door 3 times before going to bed. Years later, he would move out, go to college, start a new life. But the memory of that night never softened. It remained vivid, the feeling of the pinch, the sound of the door slamming the burnt button lying outside the window. Even now, he keeps his closet doors closed before sleeping. He laughs about it sometimes, but never fully. He once told me that he doesn't believe in ghosts, yet he can't shake the sense that something in that house wanted to be noticed. Maybe it wasn't malevolent. Maybe it was just lonely. A remnant of a fire, a whisper of a life that ended badly, trying to remind the living that it once existed. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe whatever opened that closet door had never left. Maybe it just found a new way to watch from the dark. When he talks about it now, his eyes flicker toward the nearest doorway, and for a moment, he looks 11 again, small, alert, waiting for a sound that might return at any second. He never tells the story at night. Neither do I. Because once you've heard it, every small sound in the dark begins to feel like a reminder. And no matter how tightly you close your closet door, some part of you will always wonder if it's going to stay shut.